Two cops thought they had the perfect target, mocking, laughing, and tossing papers like they owned the world. What they didn't realize was that their victim wasn't just there to defend himself. He was there to dismantle their entire game. And guess who'd be laughing last? Let's start at the beginning. Julius Carter, 32 years old, sat at the defendant's table with his hands cuffed in front of him. His tailored charcoal suit, the kind that exuded success, and his polished leather shoes looked oddly out of place against the cold, metallic glint of the cuffs around his wrists. The courtroom lights reflected off his glasses as he silently observed the scene around him. His calm demeanor, however, seemed to unsettle the two officers standing beside him, Sergeant Harley and Lieutenant Wallace. Harley leaned in, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, low enough to wound but loud enough to be heard. "So, Mr. Carter, any brilliant plans to wiggle your way out of this? You're not in your neighborhood anymore. Nobody's rolling out the red carpet here." Wallace sneered, stepping closer, his smugness palpable. "Come on, Harley, let's be real," he continued, casting a sideways glance at his partner. "How many years do you think the judge will slap on this illegal expert? 10 minimum? Maybe more if we play our cards right." Their laughter rang out, sharp and grating, bouncing off the courtroom walls. A few spectators turned their heads, curious, while others muttered under their breath. Julius said nothing. He adjusted his tie with calm precision, his face giving away nothing. His silence only seemed to embolden Harley, who reached for a stack of documents Julius had been handed earlier. With deliberate nonchalance, Harley let them fall from his grasp. The papers scattered across the floor like leaves caught in a sudden breeze. "Oops. Looks like you dropped something," Harley said, his voice dripping with mock concern. Without a word, Julius bent down to collect the scattered pages. When he straightened up, his eyes locked with Harley's for a fleeting moment. It wasn't anger in Julius's gaze, it was something far more unsettling, a cold, deliberate calculation that sent a ripple of discomfort through Harley. He shifted on his feet but quickly masked it with another smirk. The courtroom buzzed with murmured speculation. Onlookers craned their necks, intrigued by the defendant who didn't fit the typical mold. Julius's tailored suit and composed demeanor stood in stark contrast to the accusations being read aloud by the prosecutor. Charges of resisting arrest, fraud, and more. Yet beneath the surface, an unshakable tension lingered, leaving everyone wondering who really held the upper hand in this battle of wills. "Charges include resisting arrest and threatening an officer's life," the prosecutor declared, his voice steady but firm. The words hung in the air like a brewing storm, heavy with implication. Julius's attorney, a sharp-eyed, middle-aged man with an air of quiet authority, barely reacted. Leaning closer, he whispered something to Julius, who gave a single, measured nod. From his elevated bench, the judge, a stout man with a balding head and a perpetually furrowed brow, surveyed the courtroom. Even he seemed to struggle with the pieces of this murky case. Missing video evidence, vague witness accounts, and overly rehearsed statements from the officers painted an incomplete picture. Yet the proceedings carried on, a relentless machine moving forward without pause. As witnesses, Harley and Wallace recounted their version of events with practiced precision. They described Julius as aggressive and hostile during his arrest, their words punctuated by carefully crafted anecdotes. Harley even added a dramatic flourish, gesturing emphatically as he claimed Julius had made a threatening move toward him. "Right?" Julius thought, his mind a quiet storm of calculation. "Because straightening your tie is so threatening." He didn't interrupt. Instead, he sat in silence, his fingers lightly tapping against his cuffed wrists. His eyes roamed the room, analyzing every detail. The prosecutor's overconfidence, the judge's thinly veiled fatigue, and the spectator's mix of fascination and silent judgment. Meanwhile, Harley and Wallace appeared entirely at ease, their smug confidence filling the room. They spoke as though the outcome was inevitable, as though they'd already won. But Julius knew better. He wasn't here to play by their rules. He was here to rewrite them. With every exaggerated word the officers spoke, their confidence seemed to grow. But Julius's silence wasn't passive. It was deliberate. His sharp eyes flicked between each speaker, analyzing, calculating. He recognized their type. Men who wielded the system like a weapon, using it to control, demean, and dominate. What they didn't realize was that their opponent wasn't one to be crushed under its weight. The session continued, and cracks began to show. Minor inconsistencies in the officer's testimony emerged, causing the judge to raise an eyebrow at one point, though he remained silent. Julius's lawyer, composed and methodical, occasionally scribbled notes, his expression unreadable. Meanwhile, a quiet tension buzzed through the courtroom, an unspoken electricity that no one could quite name. When the gavel struck to signal a recess, Harley and Wallace exchanged smug glances, their triumph practically oozing from their every move. Julius, however, leaned back in his chair and stretched his fingers, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The atmosphere remained charged as the second session began. Julius sat at the defendant's table, his posture calm but deliberate, his hands resting lightly on the polished wood surface. Across the room, Harley and Wallace strode in, their confidence almost theatrical, as though they were performing for an unseen audience. The judge, looking more impatient than ever, wasted no time cutting through the formalities. "Officers," he began, his voice carrying an edge that suggested the day's theatrics had worn thin. But Julius wasn't focused on the judge. His attention was on the two officers, on their overconfidence, on the way they carried themselves. He was ready. "Where are the recordings from your body cameras?" the judge demanded, his voice as sharp as a gavel strike. "I expect to see clear evidence supporting your claims." For a split second, Harley's confident smirk wavered, but Wallace recovered quickly, his tone oozing with feigned regret. "Your Honor, about that. There was a technical malfunction. Both cameras stopped recording during the incident." Catching on, Harley shrugged and chimed in. "You know how it is with these devices, unreliable, always cutting out when you need them most." He threw a knowing glance at Wallace, who responded with a subtle, conspiratorial wink. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Julius's lawyer leaned over and whispered something in his ear, but Julius didn't react. His focus remained fixed on the officers, his sharp eyes dissecting their every move. The slight shift in Harley's posture, the nervous tapping of Wallace's fingers against his thigh. Their act might have convinced others, but not him. "Convenient," the judge remarked dryly, his disapproval barely concealed. "Let's move forward." Wallace's smirk widened, as if he had just dodged a bullet. Meanwhile, the prosecutor, overeager to seize the moment, launched into a barrage of rehearsed questions, determined to paint Julius as the aggressor. Harley and Wallace took turns delivering their answers, their voices smooth and measured, playing their roles to perfection. But Julius remained unmoved. He knew the truth, and as the courtroom danced to the officer's tune, he silently plotted his next move. "He lunged at me," Harley exclaimed, punctuating his words with an exaggerated gesture. "I had no choice but to restrain him." "And he was yelling threats," Wallace added, his tone dripping with false gravity. "It was a dangerous situation." The prosecutor nodded along, clearly satisfied with their theatrical performance. But Julius remained stone-faced, his hands clasped in front of him. If their story was designed to rattle him, it wasn't working. When the judge called for a recess, Harley and Wallace wasted no time cornering Julius in the hallway. They loomed over him, their confidence once again overflowing. "You really think this is going to end well for you?" Harley sneered, leaning in close enough to invade Julius's personal space. "Face it, we run this game. You're just a player who's already lost." Wallace chuckled, crossing his arms smugly. "The judge? He's practically family. The prosecutor? Let's just say he's on our side. And you're nothing but a blip on the radar." Julius didn't respond. He met their glares with a calm, unwavering intensity, the kind that made it impossible to tell what he was thinking. It was unnerving, and for a split second, even Harley seemed to falter. Harley scoffed, muttering something under his breath as he walked away. Wallace followed, laughing quietly to himself. But when the session resumed, something had changed. Julius returned to his seat with a newfound quiet confidence. He sat straighter, his gaze sharper, his presence commanding. It was subtle, but it was enough to make even the spectators take notice. A ripple of curiosity spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor stood to begin his next line of questioning, but before he could get far, the heavy courtroom doors swung open with a loud creak. Heads turned as a group of sharply dressed individuals filed in, their movements deliberate and authoritative. Behind them, a swarm of reporters surged forward, cameras flashing and microphones raised, their voices a chaotic hum. The judge looked up, startled. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the growing noise. One of the newcomers stepped forward, handing the judge a sealed folder. He leaned in, whispering something too low for the rest of the room to hear. The judge's expression shifted from confusion to thinly veiled alarm. "Court will recess for 10 minutes, the judge announced abruptly, his gavel striking with finality. The room erupted into whispers. Spectators leaned toward one another, speculating about the sudden disruption. All the while, Julius remained seated, his calm demeanor unshaken, as if he had been expecting this all along. Even Harley and Wallace exchanged uneasy glances as whispers filled the room. "What the heck is going on?" Harley muttered, his voice low. "No idea," Wallace replied, his earlier bravado now tinged with uncertainty. "But I don't like it." For the first time that day, Julius allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The storm was coming, and he was ready. When the recess ended, the atmosphere in the courtroom had palpably shifted. The judge returned to his seat, but the confident, indifferent air he had carried earlier was gone. Instead, he looked rattled, his brows furrowed as though trying to make sense of something that had blindsided him. Moments earlier, one of the sharply dressed individuals who had entered during the recess had handed him a sealed folder. Whatever it contained was clearly significant. The weight of its contents seemed to press heavily on the judge, his demeanor now marked by tension. Clearing his throat, the judge spoke, his voice tight and formal. "This court will be temporarily adjourned for a full review of the case." A wave of murmurs rippled through the spectators, a mix of confusion and intrigue sweeping the room. None, however, were more visibly shaken than the two officers standing near the prosecution table. "What on earth is this?" Wallace whispered harshly, leaning toward Harley. "This has to be some kind of joke." Harley, no longer smirking, darted nervous glances around the room. "Stay calm," he muttered, though his voice betrayed a lack of conviction. "It's probably nothing." But deep down, they both knew, this wasn't nothing. Julius Carter, calm and composed as ever, stood up from his seat. The sharp click of the cuffs being removed from his wrists echoed through the courtroom like a crack of thunder. Heads turned, and the low murmur of voices fell into stunned silence. The once dismissive crowd now watched him with wide eyes as he walked toward the judge's bench, his steps measured and deliberate. "What is he doing?" Harley hissed, his hand gripping the edge of the table as if to steady himself. "I have no idea," Wallace replied, his earlier bravado completely gone, replaced by palpable unease. The judge, now visibly uncomfortable, cleared his throat, his tone suddenly cautious. "Mr. Carter," he began, carefully choosing his words, "thank you for your patience. Please introduce yourself for the record." Julius adjusted his tie, his gaze flicking briefly to the officers before sweeping across the room. When he spoke, his voice was steady and commanding, carrying through the now silent courtroom like a wave. "Julius Carter," he said, pausing just long enough for the weight of his name to settle over the room. "District Attorney of this county." For a moment the courtroom seemed frozen, as if time itself had stopped. Then, from the back of the room, someone let out an involuntary laugh, a sharp, incredulous burst that quickly dissolved into stunned whispers. Muffled chuckles rippled through the spectators, snapping the courtroom's brittle tension like a string pulled too tight. As for Harley and Wallace, their faces drained of color. The confidence they had flaunted so brazenly earlier was now replaced by an unmistakable mix of shock and fear. Harley's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. Wallace's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Julius let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of his words to sink into every corner of the room. Finally, he turned, locking eyes with the two officers who had spent the day trying to tear him down. "Gentlemen," he began, his tone sharp yet measured, "I'm here today, not just as a defendant, but as a witness. A witness to the kind of systemic corruption and injustice that has been allowed to thrive unchecked. What you've done here today isn't just unethical. It's criminal." The cameras, which had earlier trailed the sharply dressed group, now swiveled toward Harley and Wallace. Bright flashes illuminated every bead of sweat forming on their foreheads, every nervous twitch of their hands. Julius stepped closer to the bench, his voice steady but commanding as he addressed the room. "For weeks," he continued, "I've been gathering evidence of misconduct, abuse of power, and outright lies perpetrated by these two individuals. Today was their chance to show some integrity. Instead, they doubled down, believing they could manipulate the system to their advantage. They thought themselves untouchable." Julius gestured toward the folder that had been handed to the judge earlier. "Everything you need to see is in that file," he said, his voice unwavering. Body cam footage, witness statements, even communications they believed would never see the light of day. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, louder this time, a chorus of outrage and disbelief. Julius turned back to the officers, his gaze piercing. "I've spent my career fighting for justice," he continued, his voice rising with conviction. "And trust me, I'm not stopping now." Harley and Wallace stood frozen, their earlier bravado completely shattered. For the first time, they looked vulnerable. Two men caught in a net they hadn't even realized was closing in on them. The cameras captured every moment of their unraveling, every bead of sweat, every tremor in their hands. Spectators leaned forward, riveted by the unfolding drama. Even the prosecutor, once smug and dismissive, now looked pale, darting nervous glances between Julius and the judge. The judge, his voice heavy with the weight of the revelations, finally broke the silence. "This court will reconvene after a thorough review of the evidence presented. Officers Harley and Wallace, you are to remain available for further questioning." The gavel struck, its sound final and resonant. Julius turned to face the room one last time. His expression was calm, but his eyes blazed with determination. This wasn't over. Everyone in that courtroom could feel it. The game had changed, and Julius Carter was no longer playing by their rules.